Mitaka yepi oyasin, chante washtea, nape chiujapalong. My friends and relatives, it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. My name is Link Kessler. My Indigenous ancestry is Oglala Lakota from the Pine Ridge in South Dakota, and I'm the director here of the First Nations House of Learning. I'm the fourth person to have this, to occupy this role, and my predecessors were Verna Kirkness, Joanne Archibald, and Richard Vidan. And I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the house, but before doing that, I want to introduce to you a very special person, Sayasluk from the Musqueam community, who will give us a welcome to the traditional territory.
Oh, that's a big movement downwards. Asiem, Siem Nasiaya, Sayasluk Gunesqui, Tenitinet from Musqueam. Stek when es juvenil, Kayapalano, equal Timolto. Laks when es juvenil, quis helix to Huinat, Emignaten, quis we eat and all, to sound stomach from Musqueam. And sleek when Theatala, he helix home. Set is something neat as well up, eat Theatala, Haitapka. When I know I tennis qualawan, quincy, who eat and all, Tenaquanet, quis no to mokolap. Cape Gwaii, was Nanam to Mok to Natalmok, Stahim, Tana Hunan, Haishka. I just want to say thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Larry Grant is my name. Sayasluk is my Musqueam name. I come from Musqueam and I come from Kayapalano and Quiltimolto. Those are my ancestors that were here to greet the first ships that came to this shore. They didn't chase them away or leave them without food. They welcomed them to this land. And I also want to do that this evening to everyone that's gathered here. I raise my hand and welcome to everyone here in the Stiwatan Hall at UBC. On the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Huntkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. And I understand this symposium is an itineraries of exchange, cultural context in a global frame. We just went through that in the last 17 days. I don't know if you understand what came out of that. I think it really hasn't changed from the days of Kayapalano. I'm a resident elder here at the House of Learning, an adjunct professor in the First Nations Languages program, an elder from Musqueam, and I work in the Musqueam Language and Culture program at Musqueam. And I do a lot of welcomes through that. But prior to that, I was a tradesman. I served my 4 years apprenticeship and became a machinist. From there, I became a heavy-duty mechanic in the longshore industry. And I spent from 1955 until 1999 in the trades. But most importantly about all of that, I was trained by Second World War veterans in the machine shop industry. And even at that time, in the shadow of Pearl Harbor, I had to prove myself that I was not Japanese. I had to prove, because I carried a Chinese name at that time, that I was equal to the white guys that were training me And then when they found out and realized you don't have a Chinese mind, you don't have a Chinese outlook in life. You have an Indian outlook. You're not what you look like. You look Chinese, you carry Chinese name, but everything coming out of your mouth is an Aboriginal, is an Indian. And I want to know, as a white guy, as a Dutchman from Saskatchewan, as a Dutchman from Vancouver that was a paratrooper, an Englishman that was serving time on a Corvette, how responsible are you as an Indian? And those are the guys that were training me. The guys that fought alongside of our brothers in the Second World War, our Aboriginal brothers. And I think Canada said it very, very concisely. Brothers in arms, but not on the ice. We were brothers in arms in the Second World War, in the First World War, Korea, Vietnam, today in the Middle East. Brothers in arms for Canada, for freedom and for democracy, coming from England, the heart of democracy, the seat of the caste system, England, the hierarchy that's still there today. But we're not brothers at home. We still live in our prison camps called reserves. We still don't have rights around the world. Canada doesn't step forward and say, this is the legislation that restricted you. You're not a full brother. You're a half-breed. You don't belong here. I answered those questions from 1955 to 2010. The very same questions. Why are you not a drunk? Which I was anyways for about 10 years. Why do you come to work every day after payday? Every week, if we get paid on Friday and you're back here on Monday, how come? And you come back here to work sober. Why are your sisters and mothers not down there on the street like the rest of those drunk Indians? You come to work, you're responsible, your work is excellent, you're here when you're required. And in the waterfront, in the longshore industry, we work 7 days a week. How come you're here 7 days a week? You're an Indian. You get everything for nothing anyway, so why do you come to work? So from 1955 until today, I answer those same questions. Brothers in arms, but not at home. Huh? We're good enough for cannon fodder. We're good enough for a backdrop for 2010. But we're not good enough to be full brothers. Canada doesn't want to sign the Human Rights Declaration of Aboriginal People. There's a little movement I hear today, I've just been informed, but it's already been constricted. So this is just my clash and my exchange of culture that has never changed since I was a little boy. From the time I went to school, from kindergarten onwards, until I graduated from high school, there was always this little undercurrent. Because of the Second World War, I thought, because I looked so Oriental. I thought that's the reason why. But it's not. New immigrants came to work on the waterfront, coming from nothing, coming to this land that has something, and asked the same questions, exact same questions that the people that were born here asking. So why is it that when they give you this book about Canada, so you can sign a piece of paper and say, I'm a Canadian citizen, all of this information is not there. It's deleted, like gay rights in the throne speech. So it's my exchange of culture. And it's hopefully, after these last 2 weeks, there's some positive comes out of it, but it's very scary. Because Tawani Joseph said, we invite the whole world to the biggest potlatch in the world. And what is a potlatch? It's a redistribution of wealth. They've already confined all of our wealth. They refused to deal on unceded territory. But Tawani says, we're here to give the biggest potlatch in the world. So what more are we going to share? We have shared some of the largest things in Canada, much like UBC. Musqueam is probably the largest benefactor of UBC because of all the land it sits on. But we have to argue for months and years to say, can we have this room called Musqueam Room? You know? Well, so-and-so donated $1 million, that's why he has his name on there. So-and-so donated $1 million so he can have his name over there. What has Musqueam given us? And if the group that's creating all of the new structure doesn't understand there's millions and millions of dollars worth of real estate that UBC sits on. So that's something that I just wanted to rant on. So I leave you with that. I know there's a lot of other speakers. I've taken up my 2 minutes, so I really want to say thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. As I was listening to the last few things you said, I was remembering, I want to tell you a little bit about this hall and this room. And as you were finishing your remarks, you reminded me of another lecture like this about 4 years ago, 5 years ago now. And it was the first lecture in a series of lectures that we were having that year on land issues in BC. And we finally negotiated, and I would have to say it was very much at the 11th hour for the president of the university, the predecessor of our current president, to come and open that series. And it took quite a lot of negotiation for that to happen. And part of the reason it was so difficult was that the series was going to be talking about land claims. And the university was a third party in a legal dispute with Musqueam over land, which eventually Musqueam was successful in claiming. But it was a really interesting moment because we think about all of those issues surrounding land and the history of the way that those kinds of land issues have been settled across North America. And in some places they were settled a long time ago through various means. And they were here too, through a whole series of processes. But they're still in play here in British Columbia, here at UBC, and throughout other parts of the world as well. So they're part of the structure of this entire global system, and they're things that are played out locally. And some of them are played out right here. This hall and this building were built, actually the building opened in 1993, and it was built out of the combined efforts of people at the university and private donors and First Nations communities and other Aboriginal groups in a partnership. And it was built with the hope that it would serve as a place where meetings like this could take place and other things could take place that would be of not only of benefit to Indigenous people who come here to the university, but also to other people who come in search of a better understanding of the kind of issues that are important to Indigenous people and can be important and are important to all of us. I think the designers and the people who put all that effort into the construction of this facility were certainly successful in giving us a very usable and beautiful space in which we can work. But they also took quite a lot of care to encode in the design of this building a whole set of ways to remember different and important things, and to remember things that have gone on here in this territory for a long time, and that have gone on even in this building in the short time that it's been here. And we started a little bit late, and I know we want to end at a reasonable hour. And so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but I would just like to point out a couple of features of this building. One of them is that after much deliberation, this building was built in a style that is reminiscent of the traditional style of building here in this territory, in this Musqueam style. And I think that that is tremendously important because, as our elder has told you, this is an ancient land. People have been on this spot for a very, very long time. And they have been conducting their affairs, living their lives, passing on knowledge from generation to generation right here, long before UBC and long before Canada. And we are just the most recent of the people who do these things here on this spot. And the style of this building helps us remember that long history. And if you go down to the other end of the building, you will see our library, which is unique in being the only library dedicated to Indigenous collections in Canada. And one that is unique in that it has a cataloging system that more accurately represents the representation of Indigenous materials. So it's unique in that respect as well. Architecturally, it is reminiscent of pit houses, which are typical of winter dwellings in the interior. So we've got other reminders of the history of this area embedded in the architecture. And here inside this building, we have magnificent carvings all around us, and these 4 house poles and the beams that are overhead, and the doors behind me that unfortunately you can't see at the moment. In the doorway over there, which is our ceremonial entrance that our graduates will be coming through in a couple of months. All of these are reminders of different things. And the carvings come from communities, from artists from communities all up and down the coast of BC. And that was very deliberate in a number of ways. One, in that the inclusion of carvers from many communities was a reminder that this is a house which is also a place of exchange. And it's a place of exchange with people who come from all over the world and from great distances, as many of you have. But it also reminds us that there has been exchange going on in this area, and up and down the coast in particular, for thousands of years. That this was a site of a lot of cultural exchange, long before the ones that we will probably spend most of our time discussing in this conference. So it's a reminder of that as well. In addition, each of these poles, of course, has particular features. Each of the carvings does. And each of them remind us as well of the structure of the particular communities that they come from, and of the ways in which relationships and of importance are noted and left as reminders in the carvings themselves. And because we don't have a lot of time, I don't think I will tell you what I know about each of these carvings, but I will note the fact that because they are specific to the communities they come from, in this hall they also form another function. And the other function is that they are representatives of those communities. And those communities are here with us through these things that they've given us to remember them and to indicate their support of us as they support these beams and the structure of this house. So there's a lot here that we think about every day as we move through this space, because we have all kinds of ways to remember things. And these are some of them. And of course, the other valuable resources we have are the people who come and remind us of the history and the things of importance here. The other thing I'll just close by noting is that our building reminds us of past relationships and traditions, but it's also a new space, and it's a space which is dedicated to a set of purposes which are inflected by our location here in a university and by your presence coming here for what you'll be doing over the next few days. And that's an interesting way to think about what traditions are. Traditions survive and persist in communities because they help people to live and function. And we're given the benefit of the knowledge of the traditions of the people who've shared them with us. But we also have our job, which is to think about how they apply to our contemporary situation and circumstances. And that is our task now, but it's one that we move into with the strength of all the knowledge that's preceded us and with the very hard work of all the people who've given us the opportunity we have here. And before completely closing, one more thing. I would like to note that we are very fortunate tonight to have KKN with us, sitting at the back of our hall, who is one of the organizers and a principal artist in the exhibition, which is at the Balkan Gallery. And if you are from out of town, or if you're from Vancouver and somehow have not managed to go to the Balkan Gallery, I really urge you to go there and have a look at this exhibit and look at the beauty of what you find there, but also take the time to read what has been left there for you to help you understand what is there, because it is really a very unique, it's a treasure. It's a treasure not only in terms of what's displayed there, but in terms of the understandings of it that were shared. And I'll just note that the opening event in that exhibit was something truly extraordinary, and I feel very fortunate to have been there, and I want to acknowledge KKN and thank him for the opportunity to learn at that event. It was really exceptional. And that's welcome to the hall, and I hope the conference is a really good one for all of you.
I would first of all like to start by thanking Larry Grant for offering us this welcome for our event. It's a privilege to be in this space. It's a privilege to be on this campus, and it is a real privilege to be able to bring all of you together for what I hope is the beginning of a project that will continue to do what I think it's already done, which is bringing people with common interests, common desires, and common sentiments, I think, into one space and have the opportunity to discuss these different issues that we're going to be talking about over the course of the next few days. it's interesting that, and I also appreciate very much Kikane's presence. I saw the exhibit about a month and a half ago, or I guess about a month ago, and it's interesting you mention it because in some ways the exhibit itself is a good example of why this Global Encounters initiative will, I hope, be something that is useful to this community. It was by happenstance that I discovered that the exhibit even existed. And unfortunately, very unfortunately, I've discovered about a week and a half after the original symposium that opened it. And I was regretting very much that that happened, but realizing that that experience was not something that was unique to me. And then in fact, here on this campus where we have a wealth of activities that are going on, often it is quite difficult to find out what is taking place that is of direct relevance to our areas of interest. So it's really in that spirit that this project and this initiative is sort of being propelled forward. I consider myself not so much a principal investigator, which is the title that I put on here because in theory that's the title for the grant that I received that enabled us to be here. And I should at the outset thank the Teaching and Learning Enhancement Fund of UBC for making this possible and providing this sort of impetus. And we'll thank everybody else at the closing event. But really I see that my role here as a convener and bringing people into one space and allowing them to speak. I wanted to basically take about 5 to 10 minutes and just sort of lay out what I've asked people who are coming from near and far, quite literally, to do and what you will sort of be seeing to hopefully help you interpret a little bit what's going on. The Global Encounters is meant to be a very broad thematic umbrella that encompasses, one might say everything, because who can imagine anything that doesn't sort of fit under that rubric, but hopefully it's bringing together people who have things to say to one another. And I think that we'll see as things move forward in the website in particular and the symposium that follow, whether we can sort of bring it into one frame of reference or it kind of gets out of control. But it's very much, this symposium is a beginning, not any kind of culmination. It's the beginning of a dialogue or a multi-log that is going to, I hope, take place in Vancouver between the institutions here in British Columbia and also institutions elsewhere. As you'll know if you look on the program, it's an itinerant symposium. That is, it's taking place tonight in the First Nations Longhouse, tomorrow at St. John's College, just down the road. There'll be a keynote lecture tomorrow at 2 p.m. by Sanjay Subramaniam, another keynote lecture at 7 p.m. tomorrow at the Peter Wall Institute, Professor Jonathan Lamb, and then on Saturday we will be convening at the Museum of Anthropology and visiting some of the exhibitions that are going on there. We happen to be living a kind of embarrassment of riches as far as exhibitions go, in that we have the Backstory exhibition, we have the Border Zones exhibition, the expedition as well on Saturday, and we also have another event that I just found out about this evening. This is some of you have seen the website that is meant to sort of go along with this initiative. And you see down here, there are, under other resources, there will actually be an area called exhibits, the border zones, and then the backstory, because I think it's really important that we share what's going on here at UBC with people who are potentially interested. Another exhibit that unfortunately ends tomorrow, but I just found out about it, is at the AMS Art Gallery, the sub. It's called East Meets West. And basically, the idea behind it is to acknowledge the strength and legacy of Indigenous communities, First Nations, who are meeting and to take away, in a sense, that the exclusivity of East meets West from this idea, antiquated idea, of the Orient versus the Occident, that Asia versus Europe and the West. So this is the kind of thing that I hope to actually advertise more broadly. Nicholas Thomas, who many of you, or whose work many of you know, is an anthropologist, and who I hope to be bringing to UBC next year, wrote the following, and I think it's kind of a backdrop against which I'm hoping that these different panels will work. He wrote, "Only localized theories and historically specific accounts can provide much insight into the varied articulations of colonizing and counter-colonial representations and practices," arguing for a very specific look into the layers of culture that are producing contacts and exchanges between peoples, nations, and communities. And I don't disagree in any way that this kind of subtle and highly local analysis needs to be done. But the reason that I've brought together such very diverse scholars in terms of their areas of interest and their methodological orientations is precisely to see if we can actually learn from one another, not necessarily so that we can put everything in a blender and say, look, this is the soup of exchange, let us drink from the crock. Probably crock is not the best word to use. But rather, can we learn from each other how we actually go about looking at the objects of our research and understanding through the different materials that we use how different kinds of methodologies would apply. So I've asked each of the presenters to think about three things: objects, itineraries, and then this broader category of exchange. This is a collage, montage, incoherent perhaps, of all of the different objects and their images when they have, if I was provided with an image. Some of them don't have images, of what we're going to be sort of discussing over the course of the next few days. And if it looks like an incoherent jumble, well, it probably will be a little bit of that. But the idea behind, in some circumstances, twisting people's arms to provide me with some sort of object that either represents or challenges the ideas behind the exchanges that are taking place is to concretize, to make concrete our reflections, and to be able to speak with some sort of coherent language with one another about a dazzling array of geographical and temporal subjects. We range from Asia to the Americas to Canada to South Florida to broader in the Caribbean and broader out still. So there's a huge range of what it is that we're going to be doing. I'm thrilled tonight to welcome four scholars from scholars and educators and artists, activists as well, from British Columbia, and as well as he's also from or lives in British Columbia. My colleague Coll Thrush. I hope that this will serve as a beginning of a reflection on what it means to think about local space and local identity in a much broader frame. James Clifford, who was here recently, set out a couple of questions that I thought would be interesting to just sort of hang in the air before this panel. How is indigeneity both rooted in and routed through particular places? How should we conceive of expansive indigenous regions? How expansive notions of indigenous or native affiliation can become before they begin to lose specificity and fall into post-colonial discourses of displacement. And what I think is probably the most important question for us to think about in terms of the other subjects, where is the line between indigenous and diasporic affiliations and identities? I'd like to end with a quote from a Spanish poet, Antonio Machado, I'm sure is familiar with to many of you, but it seems to me always a wonderful thing when talking about itineraries and travel and talking about beginning of a journey and how important the journey itself is. Antonio Machado wrote, "Caminante son tus huellas el camino y nada más. Caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar." Traveler, I'll also do the second part. Traveler, there is no road. We make the road by walking. And it's very much in that spirit of building a road before we're exactly sure where we're going that I thank you guys for being here and look forward to the next couple of days. So now I'd like to invite our panel to come up. Coll Thrush will comment, and he will also introduce the speakers.
Let me just begin in the way that I was taught to down in Puget Sound country, and that is to say, "Esbulha chibi to bulha chad de hwati heg al sha'at il tabich de hwati it hamasquim swatichtud." So I raise my hands to you people in this big house of the First Peoples in the beautiful territory of the Musqueam. I'll just very quickly, because I know we have a long evening ahead of us yet, I'll just very quickly introduce the four speakers, and then I have some comments afterwards, depending on what we all say. So our first speaker tonight will be Shani Casavant, who is Chief Councillor from the Hupacasath Nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And we'll get to see a little bit more, I think, about the curtains that you've heard about, if you haven't seen them already, the amazing pieces from Kikayan. And then the second speaker will be Nika Collison, who is from the Haida Nation, from Haida Gwaii. She's the Associate Curator at the Haida Gwaii Museum. And I'm going to ask people to tell us more about themselves when we start. Then Tirso Gonzales, who is Assistant Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of British Columbia in Okanagan. And then finally, Sheryl Lightfoot, who is a new faculty member here at the University of British Columbia, and she holds a position in both First Nation Studies and political science. And we've got a really interesting mix of objects for them to talk about. So we'll start with Nika. No, sorry, we'll start with Shaunee, sorry. just keeping you awake there.
Good evening, everybody. My name's Naasḳuu-isaќs, as you can see. I'm otherwise known as Shani Casavant, and I'm a Hupacasath from Nuu-chah-nulth territory on the west coast of Vancouver Island. And I'm here tonight to be part of the panel, and I really couldn't follow much of what Neil was talking about in terms of the academic approach to the panel. But what I want to talk about is a little bit is the curtain and what it means to me, and a little bit of the history, and perhaps, well, we're talking about when cultures come together and the change in society. Well, it's kind of a funny thing for us to address, because it's not like that we had any choice in a lot of the things, and that anybody absorbed some of our culture. Actually, when we talk about the curtains, they originally painted on planks that are part of our longhouses, and they represent our history. They represent things that went on in our families, our connectedness to other things, who we are. And they turned into curtains, like made out of cloth, when potlatches were outlawed, and a lot of our pieces of, a lot of our precious things were taken from us, burnt, or put into other collections. So I was thinking, isn't that weird that, we're talking about an object and what happens with that object, when there's two different cultures. And here we have the beautiful thing, the thing that we understand to be precious, and it's us in that design, in that representation, and people take it away from us. The ones that the newcomers are taking it away from us because we're not supposed to have it, but at the same time they put it in their private collections. And it's precious for a different reason. So that kind of struck me as an interesting thing to think about. And so anyway, this curtain means a lot to me. I had it came into being when I named my son. When my son was 12, he got an Indian name, and it was a name that my family gave him, and it was really important for me to do that for my son. I only have one child, so it seemed like that's a really good thing for somebody's mom to do for them. And I didn't know that I could have a curtain. My family had to come together quite a bit to plan what we would do once we decided that my son would receive an Indian name and that we would have a potlatch to celebrate that. So in the getting of the curtain, there's only certain people that know how to make them. And if you don't make them properly, it might not serve the right function that you want it to. Because this curtain, I don't know if all of you have been over at the exhibition, but it's made out of a fairly light, unbleached cotton. And I know some people think that if you're going to hang something big like that, that's 30 or 60 feet long, that it's got to be like almost heavy, like canvas. But if it is, then it's going to weigh like way too much to be carting around, and that's the whole thing, is they're portable. And the other thing is, if you were to have a thliitsapilthim, is what would you put on it? And so when I talked to my family about getting ready to name my son, we talked about what do I have the right to have on the curtain. So in the middle there is a Thunderbird design, and there's 2 sea serpents that come out the side, and there are 2 sea otters that you can see, the little animals with their sea urchin, and the dorsal fin of the whale, and the fish are there representing a river where I built a house, and there was always a lot of salmon there. We had an abundance of fish from that river. The dorsal fin of the whale is significant because that's one of my Indian names, and we're whaling people on the West Coast. I think we're the only ones that whale. And when the whale is brought, when the hunters got the whale, they would have to have a number of things that they would do before everybody could use that whale, and one would be to cut the dorsal fin out, decorate it, perhaps put something like eagle down on it to signify the reverence for it, and then bring it to the chief's house. So one of my Indian names means not just the dorsal fin, but all of the ceremony, all the ritual, all the respect that goes with that practice. The sea otters are there because my grandmother's grandmother on the West Coast, and you know that we had our sea otters, she had the right to the right shoulder of every sea otter that was killed or brought in. So at potlatches, she would sit on a carpet of sea otter pelts. So that, that makes me feel really good to be connected to a lady like that. And it's important that if I'm describing who I am, and if I'm trying to teach my son who he is, and help him understand that he comes from great people, then it's really important to have those kinds of things noted so that when we stand in front of the thliitsapilthim, that we're telling people what we are, where did we come from, what about us? The lady who sat on the carpet of sea otter pelts, her name was Punii, and not only did she have the rights to do that and to have such a lovely thing to do when she's seated at potlatches, but she was also a healer. Europeans didn't bring their doctors as soon as they arrived in our territory, so she was a midwife, and she was well known to be an excellent midwife. She would know how to turn babies, and if they were breech deliveries, and she could also mend broken bones and heal gunshot wounds, those kinds of things. So she was a well-known health practitioner as well as a royal lady. Fish is really important to us. Everything about us is fish. I come from a family of people like my dad. He's somebody that always practiced his Aboriginal right to fish. He never stopped. He started fishing when he was very young with his grandmother, and she would set a net in the canoe, and he'd be there to help her do that. And he continued to get the fish, and he would be chased by fisheries officers. My dad and my brothers would be the first ones to do the protest fisheries, and there was times when it was very dangerous. Sometimes they could go to jail. There's one story where all the fisheries people were at my dad's house, and he came out with a rifle. So all of the, it was a really risky situation where all of the RCMP and the fisheries officers had their guns trained on him. It was a very intense time for the Nuu-chah-nulth people. So the fish represent the fact that if there's fish in the river, there's a good chance that my dad and my brothers would get the most. And that's special to us. Fish is more than just the food, it's it's like the center of our lives. Like to can fish, to smoke fish, to freeze fish. And I mean, for all of us who are First Nations, when you talk about canning fish with your family, like it brings up it's a whole episode in your life. It's a whole part of the season, and looking at those jars with the flesh just right and having all the rituals that you do to can fish the way that your family does and to distribute it too. So the fish is significant. My uncle painted that curtain, Kakayan, or Chuchkamasni, that's my mother's brother, so he's my real uncle. And he told me that when you see the curtain in the gallery, you'll see that orange color is like quite striking. It's pretty bold. And I was saying that, yeah, it looks like a screaming thunderbird, because it's so bold like that. And he said, well, that kind of captured a little bit of the essence of me, that there's something that's a little out there sometimes. So I like that. I was telling you how I named my son, and some of the rationale behind that, when you reach puberty and you're a teenager, that's an important part of a child's life. That's when you're solidifying your identity. It's when things can go sideways for kids, about that age. And it was really important for me to make my son really strong and to help him know who he really is. Because, First Nations people get a pretty raw deal when you listen to what the public has to say about us. I think Larry's gone now. Larry said it really well. no matter what you do, you're still an Indian, and people still have a perception about what you are. And it doesn't matter what you do, who you are, or how you act, you're still going to be stuck with that label. And growing up in a small town like Port Alberni, it could get really racist at times, and school can be really tough. So I really wanted my son to know that the truth about us. I didn't want him to believe what it said on TV, what mean kids at school would say to him, or anything like that. I wanted him to know that he comes from great people. People that have distinguished themselves, people that were excellent. So he was able to learn that by learning some of our history, and also by having a potlatch where several hundred of our relatives would come out, and they were there to see him get a name. That's quite an honor. I mean, he was 12, and he acted like a 12-year-old boy, you know, but so he wasn't that cooperative, or, you know, like it was a burden for him to be there. But, you know, I know it stuck with him. I know that it really added to his life, and that he received an education in how to be proper, how to know what goes on at a potlatch, and what his role is and what my role is, and how to behave, how to be a good person, and enjoy people's generosity and be generous back. Feed people, entertain people, make them comfortable. The curtain's been out several times since I got it. I've used it for myself when I'm doing any kind of cultural business, but I've also brought it out for my dad's memorial, for my grandmother's memorial, for one wedding, and 2 namings that I can recall. So it comes out when there's some reason for it to be out, when it's not in public with me. Then it's carefully kept in a box where I know where it is, and it will stay clean and tidy and safe. Some people don't bring their thliitsapilthim out very often. It can be quite the experience to see a chief who's doing his business, perhaps, and see a curtain that hasn't been out forever. I was mentioning this afternoon that there's a curtain over at the exhibition that belongs to the Peters family, who are Hu'ayat, and it's just remarkable that today was probably the first time that most of them even saw that curtain. It's their family's curtain, yet it had to be brought in from a museum somewhere else in the world for them to see their own property, for them to understand where they come from and what the history was, what their ancestors said they were. So, while it may be a painting on a piece of cloth, it can be something it's something very precious to most of us who have the honor of owning one. I'm not sure how long I've been talking, Coll. A few more minutes? Okay. Everybody to meet that baby, and we'll probably put a design up there that would represent that the child was born, and maybe some representation of their Indian name, and because he's got such a lovely fiancée, it would be nice to have some image that would reflect that he has this lovely woman, you know, at his side to make a little family. If there was any other occasion that came about, I'd be quite happy to add more design work to it. That would just be a matter of making sure that I was proper and don't put anything insane on there that people might be offended by, or it would just be bad judgment. I'm sure my uncle would help me make those kinds of decisions, and it would be up to me to put in place a way to ask him to do that, because he doesn't have to. So some of us are lucky that we have relatives with gifts and they can contribute those kinds of things to our lives. And it makes me richer, but it also makes everybody else around me richer too, because I can share this. If somebody's having a potlatch and they want to name their baby, then I'm able to say at the very beginning of the planning that if you don't have a curtain, you can use mine. And I feel very fortunate, so I have shared it quite a bit, and I feel really lucky to have it. They're quite precious. If you're at a potlatch and you see somebody handling a curtain that's not theirs, you feel like going up to them and slapping their hand. No, really, like people who don't understand that you don't want it messed around with. It's something that you're just putting out there. You know, like, you don't touch it, for God's sakes. Or have your kids running back and forth underneath it or anything like that. Now, I want to see if there's any questions, but this probably isn't the time to do that. But I really appreciate that everybody came out tonight to listen to us and to share in this information that we have as a panel. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the other panel members speak too. So thank you very much. Shoot.
Haida gat la sis, the lang wad luhan gal fut kilt la. Di haida ga at di jath jinagaga, Jisgung hanudi kiagaga. Git koyas hanudi auga at skille hanudi hatka. Masquiyam at Larry the lang wad luhan gal fut kilt la, sao the lang wad luhan gaida. Debbie Sparrow, Hawa, di gudingai skistel la gutstelga. Neil, Neil, UBC and the Museum of Anthropology, Hawa. Fellow presenters at Coll, Hawa, at Tachulang, Dlangwa Luhan, Galfub Kiltla. All the good people here tonight, thank you so much for being here. My name is Jisgung. My English name is Nika, Collison. I'd like to thank Larry and all of the Musqueam people for having us on their territory. They are great for having us here. Debbie Sparrow, your food was beautiful. I am so happily and very full. Neil, UBC and the Museum of Anthropology, Hawa, for inviting me. It's an honor. Fellow presenters, it's an absolute honor to sit beside you. And our commentator, Coll, as well. And thank you for translating Neil's talk for me a couple of times. And all of you, all of my friends here tonight, thank you for being here. I'm Associate Curator for the Haida Gwaii Museum, and I'm a founding member of the Skidegate Repatriation Committee. I'd like to acknowledge Vince Collison, my cousin, friend, colleague, and the person who got me into repatriation. The Old Masset Repatriation Committee had begun a few years before us. Together, Old Masset and Skidegate work as the Haida Repatriation Committee. Shaunee Before I begin, I just want to say I was very touched by your presentation, and I wanted to share something with the audience that you may or may not have been a part of in your territory. But our president of the Haida Nation, Gujau, was there a few years ago, and the Nuu-chah-nulth people returned a song to us. The shortened version of the story is we had some sea otter hunters from home, sea otter, and we wound up, thankfully, being taken in by the Nuu-chah-nulth. They needed some help at that time, and in return they gave them a song, because like names, songs are far more valuable than any material object. And he brought the song home, and we loved that a song that was given, well over 100 years ago can be preserved and brought back to our territory. And I say hawa from our people to yours. I'd sing it, but I haven't learned it yet. Let's see, I've already forgotten about all my slides. That was when I was introducing myself in Haida. That was while I was introducing myself as an associate curator for the Haida Gwaii Museum, which is located in the Kailnagai Heritage Center, which translates into Sea Lion Town, and it's located in Skidegate in Haida Gwaii. I think I get to stay on that slide for a bit. So before we get to the object that Neil asked us to think about and bring into this discussion, I think we have to have a little quick history course here. Some of you probably know a lot of what I'm about to say, but I'm going to begin with the beginning of time, because every living Haida today comes from Chiakatlcha, which are supernatural beings that came out of the ocean. We can all trace our lineage back to a common ancestress of a raven side of our nation or an eagle side of our nation. Over those thousands and thousands and thousands of years, we witnessed a number of things that changed our landscapes and our people. By the 18th century, we had witnessed numerous floods, the Ice Age, the first tree on Haida Gwaii that was taken as a crest by one of the early, no longer living with us clans on Haida Gwaii. We, before European contact, had many interactions with other nations on the coast, in Japan, California, Hawaii. They either came to us or we went to them. There was a thriving trade route and economy on the Pacific Northwest coast long before a European economy came. To give you an idea, when coins first came around, they were hammered into bracelets, because what use is a coin when you don't have a cash economy? We also used gold as anchors and as cannonballs once in a while, to give you an idea. 1774 is the first documented European contact with the Haida. And from this point on, our world changed drastically and rapidly. I could talk for a year on the first few decades after European contact, but I've been told I have 20 minutes and that Coll is really on it. And I still have a few more pages. But I'll touch on some of the major events. 1774, European contact. Late 1700s, a smallpox epidemic. We had no way of fighting it off. We lost a lot of people in the late 1700s. But it was the smallpox epidemic of 1862 that really did in our population. It's well received that there was easily up to 30,000 people living on Haida Gwaii. And by just in maybe 40 short years or even less, there was less than 600 Haida living on Haida Gwaii. Some were living on the mainland, some were living in Alaska, but most of them died I'm not very well versed on the collector side of my story, so I'm going to take a wild guess that the first collecting was curios, the traders that came in, and we welcomed them in, like Larry said. It was a new economy, there was new opportunity, and for a while it was even a little bit not that bad, and then of course cultures, misunderstandings, and conflicts began. But some of the first collections were curios, they were ship people taking things, trading them, bringing them home for, trading us for iron or whatever it was that we wanted. But in more the mid to late 1800s, there was this new sort of movement going on by, I guess, I'm not even sure of the proper terminology, anthropologists and ethnologists, I guess, mostly. And it's continued on through today. Although it's really gotten a lot better, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. So I'm going to talk now about my object, which I think probably, knowing that I'm Haida, and maybe those of you who know me would have thought I would have picked an actual three-dimensional object or something that is of Haida manufacture. But I opted to choose a letter that I found a few years ago going through files because it relates directly to being Haida and to our history and to today. So I transcribed it, and thank you, Neil, for putting the transcription up because I forgot my transcription at home on Haida Gwaii. This was a letter from George Dorsey, I think, right, G.A. Dorsey, to Newcomb, Charles F. Newcomb, who were both pretty large collectors in the late 1800s. And it says, "Your very kind letter is just received. Yes, I plead guilty, but I had no earthly idea that you would visit the cave for skeletons, especially as you spoke of ruined villages on the west coast from which you could obtain hundreds of skeletons. Your figures sounded so big in comparison with the miserable few I got on the north coast that I held my tongue. But I am exceedingly sorry if my silence led you out of your way. Yes, indeed, I shall be glad to exchange photographs. We are a little behind with ours owing to pressure of regular museum work. We have some beauties from Masset, Kung, Custa, North Island, etc. If you will send me a set of all that you took, both on the southwest and north coast, I will return those of which we have duplicates and send you a full set of whatever we may have that is new to you. Will you kindly send me more information about the totem pole you wish to dispose of? Also about any duplicate specimens you may be willing to sell. Have you any skulls or skeletons that you will sell or exchange? Yours very truly, George A. Dorsey." This letter was written on October 26th, 1897. Now, I'm just going to flash forward for a bit because it was hard for me to read that letter, and I'm going to bring us into a bit more of a present. The Haida Gwaii Museum opened in 1976. It's a museum built on repatriation rather than collecting. And in the early 90s, Old Masset began a repatriation committee because we were realizing through various ways that our relatives' bones were in museum drawers around the world and in private homes and other labs and whatnot. So in the early 90s, the Skidegate Repatriation Committee formed as well, and we joined together. And we call this work Yahkudangang, to pay respect. It's based, our work, on mutual respect and understanding, and I want to talk about that at the end, how we can arrive at wanting to do that. So why Why did we need to bring home all these bones? One person said to me once, they're just bones, recently. Well, Shaunee, you talked about family. I mean, when you said, when I get a grandchild, and I started clapping, you know, family, relatives, community, each other. We trace ourselves back to our originating grandmother. Well, that's the Raven side, I'm Eagle. So this is a representation of Spulujat, Foam Woman, the grandmother of the Raven side of our nation. When we march in our clan parades to show who we are, like Shaunee was talking about, we wear pictures of our relatives that left before us around our necks to honor them. And we teach our children who they are. And why we know who we are is because of our ancestors, the ones who survived or didn't through European contact and the various regimes that we faced. If it wasn't for them and those less than 600 people, I couldn't be standing here today addressing you in Haida. I couldn't be here today talking about what I'm talking about. I just want to make a note. Something that I noticed when I first began this work is another way to look at how one nation respects another is, how does that nation treat your dead? I think it's pretty telling. Since then, we have brought home to Haida Gwaii almost 500 of our relatives from across North America, from museums and institutions, from private collections. I'll bring it back to the letter now. In 2003, a delegation of approximately 40 Haida, including Vince and myself, worked for a number of years with the Chicago Field Museum to bring home 160 of our ancestors. There were babies, there were warriors, and everything in between. If they were jumbled, often, you know, the records, you know, museums try and keep records, but in certain areas they're jumbled, and so we put the babies with mothers or with women. Those 160 ancestors were collected by Newcomb and Dorsey at the same time that Dorsey wrote this letter to Newcomb. We didn't know about this letter, and I think it's really important that you all know that our ancestors walk with us every single day. Today I prayed to Itkunisi, to my ancestors, to help me tonight, because they help me every single day. And somehow they helped us find this letter by fluke. It was by pure fluke. It was our ancestors who made this letter available to us. The Newcomb volumes, you know, they span a mile. And it just so happened that we had already arranged for the reburial dates back at home when we brought home our ancestors. And it just so happens that 106 years later to the date of this letter, we reburied our ancestors that were taken by these people. Most recently, we repatriated a skull from a lady, an anthropologist who'd heard about repatriation, and how she obtained the skull was her mother bought it at a garage sale from someone who'd picked it up off the shores of Haida Gwaii at a garage sale. Thank God the recipient of our ancestor knew what to do with it, and we're so thankful for her. I'm very happy to say we're working towards a successful repatriation from the United Kingdom. hopefully 2. Oh my God, I'm almost done. So that's the story around this object, but you asked to do a little bit of self-reflection. Well, here's some self-reflection. That is my daughter when she was 15 months old. She's got blonde hair and blue eyes. She's Scottish and Haida and Dutch and German, but she's Haida through and through. What makes a person Haida? I'm an undercover, or I used to be an undercover Indian. People know me now. But you heard Larry or Shaunee talk about what people say. Well, I heard almost in a weird way worse when I was living down here because I don't necessarily, funny, you don't look like one, right? So I got to hear a lot of things before people knew who I was and where I came from. So what makes us Haida? It's not just blood. It's the lands and the oceans that we come from and the supernatural that we were born from. It's the ancestors that walk with us every day. Some other reflections. In working with museums, when I started this when I was young, and I was angry. I was like, Christ, I don't even want to talk to these people. But the good thing about it is that you have to look deeper than the anguish. Why? Why are we here? Why are our ancestors, why are our relatives in drawers? And it's not always because of theft. I should say that sometimes they've been found and turned into the RCMP or into archaeology labs because of environmental conditions. And I'm thankful for this process. I was so angry in the beginning. But I'm not thankful that we have to do it. I wish we didn't. But I'm still thankful for the process because it made me look at human life, because this is the story of the world, to quote Gujao. And what I've learned over time is there are good people out there, and we can make friends, and we can use mutual respect and understanding and do great things together. When we brought home 48 ancestors from the American Museum of Natural History, Vince, myself, and his sister Trish went down for sort of negotiations because there's so many ceremonies that we have to do. And it was quite a battle at first. And this lady and I didn't see quite eye to eye, but we had to work through it, and we eventually did. And the difference in her attitude and mine from the beginning of that process to the end. In the beginning, I felt like a pesky little Indian, but they were going to do it because we had a good case. By the end of it, at 4 a.m. when they brought the bus to at 6 a.m. when they brought the bus to the hotel with our ancestors prepared to go home, out pops Enid. And I'm like, what are you doing here? And she's crying, and she said, I couldn't let them go by themselves. And that's why we travel to those places to bring them home. We can't let them come home by themselves. We don't do that with people that die today. And we won't do that with our ancestors. But the change in her, because we included her in the parts that were acceptable to include her in, and she learned, and she understood, and through that there was respect. And it's a wonderful story. I kept in touch with her for years. At home, we're not always a united front. So one time we faced a small but adamant group of our own people that wanted to do DNA testing on our ancestors. They're not bad, that is their belief. But I had a different belief, and as did most people. We had to debate it. We had to get together as a community and go, do we do this or don't we do this? And in the end, we didn't do it. And that's not what we were repatriating our people for. And it worked out in the end. So I'm pointing out, that the conflict goes everywhere. It goes everywhere, and you have to try and work it out and figure out what is best for everybody. I've got a note to look at my book now. How much time do I have? Yeah, okay. So I think that's good enough, but I would like to say, I was chatting with Anthony Shelton, and he said, objects can bring people together or tear them apart. Now, this letter that you saw earlier tore me apart. And at the time, I didn't want to work with people too much. But really what that letter did was force me to look deeper and brought me together with a bunch of new friends. You see that pride? That's from being able to be ourselves. That's how I feel every single time someone wants to be who they are on Haida Gwaii. So in closing, I'd like to say, Hawa it kunisi galangwadluhan ka diku gaga. At galangwadluhan galfut kiltla.
Good evening to everybody. I want to honor the ancestors of this land and the descendants of the previous generations who were here before the colonizer arrived. And allow me to say a few words in Aymara, which is where my roots are. Asquiurufan, Hilatanaka, Cuyacanaka, Nayana Sutijaja, Tirso Gonzales. Tengan todos ustedes una buena sesión, hermanos y hermanas. Mi nombre es Tirso Gonzales. Hello to everybody. My name is Tirso Gonzales. I come from Peru, from the Aymara people. Neil asked me to present a series of slides that were going to be running while I was talking, not necessarily making a connection with them. But here I am. Fundamentally, the presentation of my object. I started to deal with the seed when I started to write my master thesis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I said, I want to know what the seed is about. So I started, because I was in sociology at UW-Madison, a land-grant college in the United States, a science-based agriculture department. So I asked, what the seed is about. And I used the political economy approach, which is one of the most radical approaches coming from Marxism, right? Comes from Western societies, but still is a Western Eurocentric approach. Then I said, well, this is not enough. So I'm going to try to dig, what the seed is about with a political ecology approach, because, Marxists were, trying to understand, how identity and nature fit in their scheme of things. And in that process, I realized that at the same time that I had to honor this Western Eurocentric approach, radical approach, which, helps to understand, capitalist society and the way that people are exploited. I said, it's not going to be possible to try to understand this, what the seed is about in the indigenous world. So a metaphor came into place, which was, basically the culture of the commercial seed and the culture of the native seed. To begin with, this story has been unfolding through, my own process of re-indigenization and what Wes Jackson mentions in terms of becoming native to this place. And I want to be very short, because this is related to worldviews, this is related to language, this is related to our ties to the land, this is a process of re-indigenization, this is a process of remembering. Remembering not necessarily in the physical way that, in some cases, many indigenous people have been dismembered, as it has been the case, when Tupac Amaru was dismembered physically in Peru, early in colonial times. In any event, here you have, I'm going to talk about Andean Pacha and Mama Kawsay. The issue is that language is going to be, our challenge, because language nets in place. But you see, I have to be schematic, and I don't like to be that way. But in any event, here you have the culture of the commercial seed embedded within the westernized world, right? The commodification of life. And on the other hand, we have the cultures of the Andean native seed and its wild relatives. So this, right at the beginning, is telling us that the seed, on the one hand, right, on the left hand, is considered an object. And the scientific approach has used and manipulated the seed in a way that fundamentally is related to profits. It is not to enrich life. It is not to have better tomatoes or better potatoes. It is in order to make, business. And in that process, many aspects, are, narrowed down. The genetic diversity of life is being narrowed down. Diversity is a factor that goes against this particular way of dealing with the seed. On the other hand, the seed in the Andean indigenous world, and I would say that, in all the indigenous world, fundamentally is not an object. It is a person. It is a living being. It is a relative, among many other relatives. But because in the Andes, life is agrocentric, then the seed, is one of the most important elements of life. I was talking to you about, Mama Kawsay and the local Pacha. And the issue is that when we talk about the local Pacha, which in English, a poor translation is place, what we have is more than that. Local Pacha, right, place is the representation of the macrocosms at the microcosm level. So whatever happens, at the larger scheme of things, it is happening in place. But let's, again, be careful with language, because language, when we look for a Google translator, is going to be a bad solution. So what happens is that, when we talk about place, we are talking about the world of relatives, but also a world of equivalent living beings. Nobody is more than the other. We all are equal, and we all are persons. So some people, like some anthropologists from my country, can say, well, all of this is nice, but in reality, this is a beautiful story that should be just in the books. The reality is that we are dealing with worldviews, languages, concepts, theories that have not honor, place in the Indian way. And I'm talking about a major important issue, which academically speaking is, the theories of development. Development as we are living today. And what development has caused is fundamentally an erosion of the indigenous cultures, not only of the Andes, but the world as a whole. So now let me give you, the practicality of why I am making a case for not only the seed in the Andes. I'm making a case for what culture is about within the indigenous world, for languages in the indigenous world, for other ways of being, other ways of knowing, and other ways of being related to the world. According to some numbers, statistics, some people say that the indigenous peoples in total are around 350 million. But if you go to check not so recent statistics from the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, they say that a small-scale farming, right, those that are less than 5 hectares in the world, and this is not, all the countries in the world, it's just a selection of 17 countries from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. this small-scale neutral term, right, tells us that there are around 1.25 billion people who are small-scale farmers. This is the problem, again, with theories of development, concepts coming from the Euro-American Center view of the world that are not honoring something that we have to put our elbows in order to make room for a better conceptualization. What I'm saying is that if we were in a process where countries like Canada or countries in Latin America or countries around the world, our leaders, right, we're committed to a process of re-indigenization, indigeneity, becoming native to this place, then if we add up, the 1.2 something billion small-scale farmers with the 350 million indigenous peoples, we would make 1.5 billion peoples. Okay, you don't need to believe me. Start to work on that. But don't follow, the concepts and the statistics, that are being sold, by some institutions like the World Bank or, the Inter-American Development Bank or the FAO statistics. Because it is very hard to get numbers in regards to indigenous peoples about the land that is still in the hands of indigenous peoples and so on. But this is important because what I'm trying to make a case for is about, yes, development, but a different type of development, self-determined development, place-based development, based on the particularities, and this is what the seed allows me to take a look at. Local knowledge, right? Indigenous knowledge is place-based. It is context-specific. So we can't follow. We would be, very, very bad students if we would follow what, we learn through the scientific approach of standardizing agriculture, which has been the proposal for, the world as a whole, but for indigenous peoples in particular, when the Green Revolution, a science-based approach, was promoted around the globe. And we know the consequences. It is unsustainable. But the worldview that is embedded within this particular approach to agriculture, which is not just about agriculture, it's also about education. Monocultures of the land, monocultures of the mind. Colonization of the land, colonization of the mind. So we need to be careful in the way that we start a process of decolonization. And definitely, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is the backdrop. It is the blueprint in order to move forward. So my case is also in order to make the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples work, because it took more than 10 years with, uniting our minds in order to arrive to a proposal. Some of my students say, this is a list of complaints. It's more than that. It's the blueprint for self-determined development. Okay, I don't know what happened. The next one. No. Oh, okay. So now all right. So this is my object, right? Okay, let me now talk. Fundamentally, what I was trying is to show you that in this process, I am not just, academically speaking, concerned about the seed. I am also practically, concerned about the seed, because the numbers that I gave you, who are, the most important producers around the globe that put, most of the time food on the table? Indigenous peoples, small-scale farmers. If a process of re-indigenization were to take place, then we would be, moving towards a different story. Okay, so 70% of this of the producers of food in the world are, fundamentally related to the indigenous small-scale farming. The story can be, branched out. I'm gonna now, get more in terms of what is going on in the Andes. Peru and Ecuador and Bolivia hold around 15 million peoples. In total, according to some statistics, the indigenous population of Latin America is around 48 million peoples. But that is because, the census. and the census have not been implemented in the best way, according to the Inter-American Development Bank. If a new census were to be implemented in Latin America, the population would double. So that means 100 million people. How many million people in Latin America today? 560 million people, right? So the thing is that, when I started to deal with the seed and what the seed is about, I started also to make a move towards re-indigenization. And it's not by accident that I moved from the political economy to the political ecology and then to where I am staying these days, Indigenous studies. Some people ask me, what is your discipline? Well, in the past, sociology, rural sociology. But today, and listen to me well, I tell them, I am a very undisciplined person. But listen to me well, because I am a hinge. And that means I have to walk, both paths. I have to walk the path of, modernization, development, Western Euro-American center theories. But all of them have failed for the last 60 years of modernization in regards to indigenous agricultures in Latin America. And the potential has always been there. It is the glasses that we have used, the lenses that we have used in order to understand what the seed and what it's embedded, and how the seed is embedded in language, worldview, a different world of relatives, and so on. So for that reason, the more that I was moving towards indigenous studies, the closer that I was in the process of re-indigenization. And this didn't happen overnight, and didn't happen just through a mental, work. There is a book, and I don't want to be irreverent here, that part of the title says, my name is such and such, I am in recovery from Western civilization. Well, to me, my own recovery, my own detoxify process was through rituals and ceremonies. And through that process, I started to regain strength on who I am. Now, I left, this title from Wes Jackson in terms of becoming native to this place. And Wes Jackson, for those who don't know him, he is the director of the Land Institute in Kansas City. And fundamentally, he said, we had the opportunity to learn from the Indians, but because we killed them, and he's talking about the United States, we have not been able to learn from them. The second opportunity has been, we had the opportunity to learn from the settler, but because the settler was in this kind of madness, the gold rush, right? Moving from west to east, they never settled down. There is a book from Wendell Berry which talks about the unsettling of America and the lack of character of American society. And that has to be related to the worldview that is embedded within that society. I don't want to talk about the issue of reservations because perhaps just a number and can help us here quickly. The private agricultural land in the United States in terms of surface value, economic value, according to this beautiful stratification, the racist stratification in terms of whites, Black Americans, Native Americans. I didn't create that stratification, right? That is racism. That classification shows us that white people have 96% of the surface and 97% of the value of the private agricultural land in the United States. So what remains about place? When we know that, homogenization of the land, homogenization of cultures, is taking place brutally in the United States. Not to speak how the United States and many other, countries sell this Euro-American center paradigm of development, which erodes, indigenous peoples' lives, cultures, languages, and so on. So, I have to talk a little bit about the methodology. You see, in the indigenous world, in the Andean indigenous world, even Catholic religion has a place, but a different place than, in other places. If your God contributes to balance and harmony, welcome, because that's what we want. And the priest has a role to play, and the crucifix has a role to play, and God has a role to play because, they also are procuring balance and harmony. So it's not this just, a conversion towards, Catholicism. It is how we adopt and adapt, this religion in order to procure balance and harmony. Okay? So in that process, the closer that I got to, the indigenous Andean communities that I work with, scattered throughout the Andes of Peru, but these days, in close connection with Bolivia as well as, with Ecuador, they used, the people that I know, something that is called cartillas de saberes. And saberes, just a hint, the Latin word of saberes is sapere. And sapere means tasting. So you know by putting all your senses in order to grasp what is, in your immediate connection with, that particular relationship. There is a lot of knowledge within indigenous peoples, but there is also, a lot of saberes. And the cartillas, the booklets of saberes, the booklets of knowledge, in quotation mark, have been one of the means in order to begin a process that at a very small scale is showing the potential of going for a larger scale project that involves the central Andes of Latin America. These cartillas de saberes can show you that the knowledge still, in the case of the Andes, is with the elders. The elders are, the central players. And they, as well as the communities in the Andes, fundamentally are not, in bad shape. So what I'm trying to say here is that if more attention and a better approach were to take place in regards to these indigenous Andean communities, together with other experiences that are happening, in the Andes. I can name the Andes Association, which is located in Peru. I can name Agruco, which is a major player in Bolivia as well as in Latin America. And it is curious because Agruco, as well as the institution that I very close to, they are using the cartillas de saberes, and they are, creating, because knowledge in the Andes is place-specific, context-specific, then the issue is that you cannot replicate the knowledge that is related to a community into another community. But the beauty is that, this is mushrooming. So whatever, you see, and the cartillas, the booklets, help to evoke, right? Then other people start to, work towards that. And in that process, what is being created, it's a calendar, a sophisticated calendar, place-based, which is basically related to crops, foods, ceremonies, the constellations, the phases of the sun, the moon, and all the activities. The potential is greater because based on that, we can start to work with, a school and how we move from, the universal history, Euro-American Center, to place-based stories and histories. And unfortunately, my time is over, but I would be very happy to talk to you about this experience, and my article has been placed on the website for this particular conference. There is much more to say about the seed, and I thank you very much.
I'm not the tallest person in the world, so I'm going to come on down. Anin Anishinaabe, greetings to all of you. I'm pleased and honored and humbled to be the last speaker tonight, and I hope you'll bear with us just a little bit longer. We've had a good lineup, and I just want to share my thoughts and comments with you tonight. My name is Sheryl Lightfoot. I'm an Anishinaabe, so I'm not actually from BC. I'm come from very far away from here. I'm Lake Superior Band, so I'm from the shores of Lake Superior, which is, about 2,000 miles, 4,000 kilometers away from here. I'm from the southern shore of Lake Superior, Susan. But my nation, of course, traverses the border. It's half on the Canadian side and half on the American side. I actually grew up in Minneapolis, During the 1970s, the height of the activist movement for Native Americans in the States was largely centered in Minneapolis. And so a lot of my background, experience, original knowledge of politics and activism comes right directly from there. My PhD is in international relations, however, and my research program is on Indigenous rights at the transnational level. But that research, that activity, that history, deeply rooted in that activist experience of the 1970s. It's shaped who I am, it's shaped my research, it's shaped what I talk about. So now as I look at the global Indigenous movement and the Indigenous rights movement on the transnational, the global, the international level, both inside and outside the UN system, I bring forward that history of activism, both my identity as an Anishinaabe from my home community and also that heritage of activism from the urban area. I'm really, as I said, deeply honored and humbled to follow this panel of speakers tonight. Shaunee, Nika, Tirso. It's a pleasure and a privilege to hear you, and it's actually humbling to follow you because this was amazing. But it's because of what you all had to say that I have to say what I have to say, because it builds on all of your contributions today. The object that I want to talk about is actually the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there's not a very interesting image to go with this because it's essentially a lot of words on paper. But trust me, it's a lot more than just words on paper. What it means to us is that in order to secure individual, distinctive Indigenous communities, histories, stories, visions, culture, societies, political organization, economic organization, ways of life. In order to protect all of these things, we need a right of self-determination for all Indigenous nations to be recognized and secured internationally and domestically. Self-determination, by this we mean the right of peoples to freely determine social, cultural, political, economic affairs, is a fundamental human right that since 1948 has been internationally recognized and as inherently held by all human beings, all peoples. But self-determination is the fundamental human right that up until 2007, with the passage of this document at the General Assembly, was a right that was deliberately denied us as Indigenous peoples. For 50 years, the United Nations organization operated a decolonization effort that was guided by a principle called the saltwater thesis, sometimes called the blue water thesis. That thesis stated that only overseas territories over salt water, qualified or were entitled to self-determination, decolonization. That was an effort to deliberately exclude us from the same right. The right that is, again, inherently a human right, attached to all peoples as an element of their humanity. But this declaration, passed by the General Assembly in September 2007, made a fundamental correction to this exclusion. And it stated that Indigenous peoples, like all other peoples on the planet, now also enjoy that fundamental human right of self-determination. It took about 30 years of Indigenous efforts at the UN and working at the global level, connecting transnationally through the United Nations, outside the United Nations, working in the human rights committees and subcommittees in order to secure this right of self-determination, our right to determine each of our unique and distinctive paths. Protect our cultures, protect our histories, protect our stories. So the global Indigenous movement has looked to this organization of states, ironically enough, the United Nations, especially the human rights regime, as a source of both moral authority and moral leverage to use against these systems of oppression. Most often the oppressor that we're talking about is the surrounding state, the countries, the governments that claim sovereignty, jurisdiction over us and our territories. So I want to spend my time tonight talking about this object, this Declaration on Indigenous Rights. What does it do exactly for Indigenous peoples? Why is it more than just words on paper? What is the opportunity that it presents? And more importantly, just as importantly perhaps, what are its limitations that we need to be cognizant of as we move on this itinerary, as we move on this journey of indigeneity? So first off, just a quick background. What are we talking about when we talk about the world's indigenous peoples? There are multiple definitions out there, but the UN working definition claims that there are about 300 million indigenous peoples on the planet. It's about 6% of the world's population. These are not small numbers. There's about 5,000 distinct nations on the planet, or peoples that identify as indigenous across 6 continents and 72 countries. This is a huge scope. And what do all of these 5,000 individually unique, distinct peoples share in common? Essentially 2 experiences. First, we've all shared some sort of marginalization, discrimination within our cultures, within our societies. But just as important, we've all been victims of a colonial project in one form or another of assimilation. The global indigenous movement, which was born in the 1970s, aimed to address both of these dual experiences, these experiences which are common to indigenous peoples throughout the globe. And while the organizational beginnings of this movement were based in Canada and in the United States, the movement's vision was entirely global from the outset. The 2 organizations that launched this movement, the International Indian Treaty Council and the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, were both essentially grassroots organizations, but organizations that also had a global vision. So both IITC and WCIP sought UN status in the very same year, 1977, and both initially set out on an agenda which placed as its first and top priority the recognition by the international community of indigenous peoples' right to self-determination. International recognition of this right of self-determination for indigenous peoples would also provide an international standard against which states could be held accountable for their behavior in the international sphere. Such an international standard would provide moral and political leverage with oppressive state governments, calling them out individually on their patterns of marginalization and their projects of assimilation. Such a document as this would also provide guidance for states who wish to change their behavior and their policies and restructure their relationships with indigenous peoples towards a stance of mutual respect rather than domination. This global movement looked to the UN human rights system as the means to attain such a standard which could potentially create the best possible global conditions which would respect the distinctiveness of each of these 5,000 nations, each nation's culture, history, politics, economy. There were and continue to be several important limitations and implications of relying on, again, the United Nations state-based human rights system. First, important to remember, the international human rights law is legally unenforceable. There is no court, no enforcement mechanism for indigenous rights or any other human right for that matter. Secondly, other countries and the international community are the only true enforcement mechanism that can be relied on. It is up to other countries to hold any individual country accountable. Thirdly, on this journey, the Declaration or any human rights mechanism can only be used as a tool of moral persuasion. Essentially, they're political documents. So this Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People took 30 years to develop, draft, pass through the United Nations General Assembly. It's a document that lays out not a ceiling, but a floor. It's the bare minimum standard of indigenous people's rights that all states are obligated to respect. Note I said all states. It is not international law. It's not legally enforceable. It is, however, morally binding on all states, not legally binding. It represents a global consensus on indigenous rights. It articulates rights for indigenous peoples as individuals. But for the first time in the history of the human rights system, it also recognizes that groups or collectivities also have human rights. Fundamentally, it articulates that all indigenous peoples, like all peoples on the planet, have this right to self-determination. It is a moral and political document meant to be used in a persuasive, read that as political, context. and intended for implementation on a state-by-state-by-state-by-state basis. It has never been viewed by the global indigenous movement as any sort of panacea. It's one tool to be used in addition to multiple domestic avenues to achieve justice for indigenous peoples. With all of that in mind, however, the passage of this document by the UN General Assembly was an absolutely momentous occasion. 30 years of work at the UN, and the global indigenous movement was jubilant. And I just want to take a moment to read a couple people's quotes from the day of passage. Andrea Carmen, Executive Director of the Treaty Council, described it. I was so privileged to sit in the chamber that day, on the floor of the General Assembly, to see the voting on the scoreboard go up and realize that after all of these years, we finally got the declaration adopted. The website of the same organization later in that day declared, "History is made for indigenous peoples at the United Nations. Treaty rights, land rights, and self-determination of indigenous peoples are recognized internationally with the adoption of the declaration." Another individual, Les Malazar, chairman of the Global Indigenous Caucus, said that the adoption of the declaration marks a momentous and historic occasion for both indigenous peoples and for the United Nations. One delegate was coming from Africa was so moved by the event he couldn't even gather the words to speak. Grand Chief Edward John said, "It's a tremendous day. It's all over now, and we have in our hands a declaration that we helped construct and one on which we proudly stand." Victoria Tali Corpuz, chairperson of the Permanent Forum, stated that the 13th of September 2007 will be remembered as an International Human Rights Day for Indigenous peoples of the world, a day the United Nations and its member states, together with indigenous peoples, reconciled with past painful histories and decided to march into the future on the path of human rights. The voting record that day showed 143 countries voting in favor of the declaration. 11 countries abstained, including notably Russia and Colombia. 36 countries were absent, which is an abstention of sorts, and 4 countries voting against. 30 long years of struggle, the declaration passed the General Assembly. We would call 143 votes an overwhelming margin. The world's indigenous people now had an international standard. The only countries in the world to vote against it that day were Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and Canada. Each of these countries issued statements immediately following the vote to clarify the reasons why each of them had stood in opposition to the declaration. The 4 countries' statements are remarkably similar. They express misgivings about language, transparency of the process, which, by the way, they all had fully participated in and tried to obstruct for the full 30 years. They express concerns about incompatibility with their domestic laws and their commitments to the equality of all their citizens. Canada, the only one of the 4, indicated support for the spirit of Indigenous rights as articulated in the declaration, but objected to this particular document. All 4 countries emphasized that the declaration would not be binding on them at all in any way since they did not vote for it on the floor. This, however, is not the norm in international human rights because international human rights standards represent that international consensus. The UN considers always all states bound by a human rights standard, whether they voted for the standard or not. The rights are inherent. I'm sure there are plenty of state oppressors in the past that found human rights to be inconvenient while they were oppressing their people. Nevertheless, they are bound by the human rights standard. So states can't just exempt themselves from particular international rights standards they find inconvenient or expensive. They will still be held morally accountable to that standard, regardless of their particular individual vote in the General Assembly. In April of 2009, so we're coming up on a year, the new Rudd government of Australia issued a statement that it was going to officially change its position on the declaration to one of support. While the statement by Foreign Affairs Minister Jenny Macklin was certainly clear on that point, there were also a number of little footnotes and caveats in that statement, which I also want to highlight. There are 4 occasions that in Jenny Macklin's statement, she says that the declaration was aspirational, and as such, an aspirational document, Australia would support it. Then there were also several mentions of the non-binding nature of the document. And then, just to add to it, the statement was also very clear that the change in official position by Australia would in no way affect existing Australia law and policy. Here in Canada, in the speech from the throne just delivered yesterday, Governor General Jean stated that, and this is a significant move, a growing number of states have given qualified recognition to the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. I'm not sure who she was referring to there. Australia is the only one I know that's qualified their recognition, but we'll go with it. Our government will take steps to endorse this aspirational document in a manner fully consistent with Canada's Constitution and laws. Today, the Assembly of First Nations issued a press release that the National Chief is very encouraged by Canada's commitment to endorse the declaration. I'm going to argue it's something far short of that. I'm going to actually agree with Grand Chief Stuart Phillips' statement that the statement from the speech from the throne actually gives an illusion of support, an appearance of support, but something far short of actual support. Both Australia and Canada have chosen their words very carefully, in my view, to change public perceptions of their position while holding fast to the substance of underlying resistance to this document. None of this comes as a big surprise to me. My initial reaction to all of this yesterday was, yeah, I expected something like this, because everyone's been asking me the same about the Obama administration. Will they change their position? I say, yeah, it'll look like Australia's if they do. Each country seems to be trying to save face in some sense in the international community without fundamentally altering its position of opposition to the document itself. Each seeming move on this seems to be already circumscribed or constrained before we even get the conversation going. But then I have to step back and I have to look, and I also have to say that the fact that both countries are even attempting such careful maneuvering, such careful crafting of language, indicates to me that some of this moral and political pressure, this international system of accountability, could possibly be cracking the egg on the beginnings of having an impact on these countries. But before I get too jubilant about that, I want to make sure we recognize that we have lifetimes of work ahead of us in this area. The road is long, the journey will be difficult. Implementation of a document like this, a non-binding international standard on Indigenous rights, remains an absolutely serious challenge, especially when we're dealing with such powerful states. Implementation has to continue on a state-by-state basis, using this declaration in our best efforts as a moral tool of leverage in a global political environment. Miigwech. Thank you.
So in the interest of time and having some discussion, I just want to say maybe 5 minutes worth of things, just some thoughts. As a scholar of Indigenous history, it's really exciting to be here. It's exciting to be on this panel in particular, and to have this panel be part of this kind of conference. Because it's clear that trying to integrate Indigenous history and histories with global history and histories, there's a lot of work left to be done. It's a long road, to use your term. Because when I've been sort of scanning this literature, looking for models for my own work, there's some models out there that are pretty tried and true, and unfortunately, they're just unfortunate, I guess. One is, when we want to include Indigenous people in the story of global history, say in the global history of food, we show indigenous people to say what we were all like in the Neolithic, before we sort of got on with the rest of history. So we'll show you some San people from the Kalahari or whatever, and then on we'll go with the Babylonians and so on. And we never see indigenous people again. Or we see indigenous people purely as victims, and we all know that story. There's truth in it, but we know it's more complicated. Or what I see increasingly in models of global history or world history classes, for example, I think this comes up a lot, or in textbooks, is the sort of, Indians had it too kind of approach, which is, okay, we show the Aztecs and the Mayans, and look, they built big buildings, and they had, caste systems and things like that. And then again, on we go with history once that's ticked off the list. And I have yet to see really good models for how we do this, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. One is that our storylines of globalization, of global history, are so fraught with the baggage of racialization, of questions about scale, of mistaking people for time periods, of mistaking places for time periods. This is where the past lives, over here. The future is based over here. That's, the Stone Age people, when they talk about the Stone Age people that live in Papua New Guinea, well, they're not in the Stone Age, they're in the 20th century when you were writing about it. There are these kinds of narratives, teleologies, tautologies that we're stuck with, even the sympathetic ones, which are so troubling sometimes. And I've watched the scholarship try to wrestle with this, and we have some of the language, facing east from Indian country, decentering the Renaissance, provincializing Europe. We have the phrases, but we're still struggling with how do we do that in meaningful ways. And because the narratives are so troubling and trapping, I'm wondering this idea that Neil has had us all come around together around of objects. I wonder what can that add? And so as I was thinking about the objects that you all talked about today, I'm thinking of the first three in particular. The thliitsapilthim, is that close? All right. And you must see those while you're here, if you're visiting. Actually, and if you're here, you just must see them. They're amazing. Our class saw them this morning. They're incredible. And then the skulls, and then seeds. And what I thought about as I was listening to these is that these have all been understood for far too long as dead objects. Just bones, things that belong in a museum, things that belong in somebody's private collection, things that once the indigenous knowledge is taken and the seed is then transformed into something that's commercially useful on a larger scale, then the thing itself is kind of a dead object. And if anything, this panel has proved that wrong. I was really moved by that today, seeing the curtains in the galleries. That not only are these objects alive, they're actually, as you said, Tirso, they can in some cases be beings. And what would it be like for those of us that are in sort of more traditional disciplines of history or anthropology who don't work so much in indigenous studies? What if we actually talked about some of the objects that we write about and that we'll be talking about this weekend? What if we talked about those as beings? Because in some cases they can also be understood that way. And I know that's something that I'm starting to think a lot about in my own work. So how does it relate to the fourth object, this declaration? And I would argue that the first three objects are the genealogy of the fourth, right? This declaration is a very abstract thing. I know my own students, when they read it, they see it as kind of abstract, aspirational, and they say that with kind of a sneer almost, like, how dare you be aspirational? Like, stop being so naive. That one of the ways that I think we need to get at that kind of object, an object like that that's so abstract in many ways and is operating kind of up at almost a more cerebral level, is to repopulate it with the objects that make it real. And that's what I think the first three were about. These objects that those are the evidence for why this other document exists. And I think that's partially related to the problem we have as historians of world history or larger scale histories, is how do we tell those bigger stories and have them be repopulated with the kind of the micro-histories? I find I oscillate a lot in my own work between the micro-history and the macro-history. I often forget that the nation-state exists sometimes, or I just prefer it didn't exist. But how do we do that when we tell these big stories that we all wrestle with, whether it's in our classes or in our own written work? And this kind of juncture of these four objects, I think, gets at that. And I've been thinking about what would I have offered. Neil asked us as commentators to offer our own objects, and right now I'm just starting a new book on an Indigenous history of London, England, looking at the city's history through Indigenous travelers who went there willingly or otherwise. And so I've been thinking about the mirror of an Elizabethan astrologer who helped envision the British Empire. It was an Aztec mirror that he would use to sort of have visions in. I'm thinking about the hat factory covered with beaver gargoyles on Oxford Street that was, of course, built by Indigenous labor. It was built by the fur trade. I'm thinking about the museum in Docklands, which is this huge museum of sort of multicultural England in the East End, and it has a Pocahontas room in the basement. And I keep thinking that Pocahontas room is an object of a city trying to understand its multicultural past through an Indigenous woman. But I was thinking most about a monument that I saw in the cemetery of Southwark Cathedral, just on the south bank of the Thames. And it's a monument to a Mohegan man who went there in 1736, and before he could meet with the king to pursue land claims, he died of smallpox. And in 2006, his monument was unveiled by the Queen to remember, and this guy's people, to remember his time there. So over that, many, many years, 270 years, his story was remembered. Here's a guy who went to London and sort of disappeared off the face of the earth to these people. But these stories are still alive, and I've been trying to think about these objects and the right verb about what's happening with them. And I've been thinking about restoring and reviving and repatriating. It's all this which assumes that the stories went away. It assumes that they stopped being alive, and I think that's not quite the right way to talk about it. And so, I think we struggle with language around this in really powerful ways, and we get stuck inside the same old stories. And I'm hoping that what we can do this weekend is carry some of this Indigenous material forward, and I'm really grateful, Neil, that we weren't just at the beginning, because these issues show up again and again throughout the weekend, and I really hope that'll continue. So those were just some thoughts for me, and I'm really curious to see what kinds of questions you have for the panelists. So thank you.
Yeah. Especially it's late already for us on the West Coast, for people who came from the East Coast. So I wanted to cram a lot in, but also conscious that everybody's very tired. How we can do is anybody who has any question will allow the questions, everybody will ask their questions first, and then we'll give each panelist an opportunity to respond to whatever sort of floats their boat. And of course, that has to leave. The other three members of this panel will be here both today and Saturday, integrated into our discussions. So this is certainly not the last opportunity. So we can just sort of throw it over.
Do you want me to do this or you?
No, you go. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So, it's open.
We must have done a good job. We're out of here. Hey, good job. I've been sharing your water with you. I'm sorry.
No, it's yours. I got mine.
Yeah, we did a good job then.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Everybody's tight.
Yeah, it's late now.
Yes. Josh.
What do any of you see in terms of the potential of, trying to find the right word, working with people that may or may not be from your community? So with academies, so in terms of people that are sort of grassroots in the community, but also people that are sort of a bridge or a canoe or a path to academies or institutions, organizations. How do you see that? Like, how do you negotiate that? What are some potential ways that, both or different parties can be working together towards some kind of...
So let's see what other questions there are, and if not, we can go forward with that.
I have a specific question regarding the curtains.
Okay.
Is that, I am a quilter and I see the quilt, which was made, I think, from people different nations, indigenous nations here. So my question to you directly, and I apologize for my ignorance, is you referred to the fact that the script then was made by your uncle. So, but you also talked about how you were part of the process. So why so, and not why you make your curtain like I would do my quilt. If I had a baby that I wanted to honor, I would do my own quilt. Perhaps involving the family, but do you see what I'm asking?
Yes, I do.
So any other questions to get on the table? All right. Sean,
Yep.
Shani, would you like to start?
Thanks for asking that question. My uncle's an artist, and he's been drawing, painting, carving, engraving jewelry for, oh gosh, probably over 50 years for sure. And he's very skilled at that, and he's very knowledgeable about our culture, images, how the artwork is done. I'm not. And I wouldn't have been capable of doing a job like that. One curtain, I can't even guess how many hours, but I know he stays up. He'll stay up like 24 hours working on the paint, painting the designs, drawing the designs in pencil. And I know it's an incredible amount of work. And he's gifted in terms of his drawing and painting.
So then there was Josh's question about the relationship between the academy and people doing work in communities and what that looks like and what are the prospects there. So do people want to speak to that?
I would like to at least say something about that. To me, my role is something different than the traditional scholarly work of business as usual. I am a facilitator. So not anymore, the one who has the privilege to be called the expert. Because with that, I am reiterating, that this colonial mentality, that, fundamentally you are the knowledge holder, which is not truth. It never has been. It is better for me to position at this point in my life and in time, in my academic career and in my activist work, in a way that I contribute to the agenda of the community, that I listened to those who can teach me, instead of going and pretending that I am the one who knows. Because I can't speak for the whole world, but in connection to the communities that I am related to, I am a student. I am a learner. I am in a process where without my people, I wouldn't be here. Because whatever I have learned, either through them or through the books that were written about them, they have been the sources of knowledge, always. So my role is, to be a hinge, that's what I said, right? A facilitator. Somebody who, for a number of circumstances, was uprooted without my will from his community. Painful though, but that is the reality. And, the challenge is for me to do what, it was the third option that Wes Jackson was saying, that I didn't mention, right? I mentioned, how, we lost the opportunity, he said, from, Native Americans. Then how we lost, the opportunity to learn from the settler. And what is the last opportunity that we have, he says? To become native to this place. And what does that mean? Fundamentally, to be in tune with where you live, your immediate environment, right? Whatever, that is. Could be, Kansas or whatever. Then the country that, you belong to. And to the world, right? So the issue of indigeneity, allow me just, 2 more minutes. these days, definitely we have to make a case for, the long overdue agenda of indigenous peoples. That is no question. I mean, that is not under question. I mean, the struggle for indigenous peoples towards self-determination, towards recovering the land, for having control over the cultural resources. I'm not talking about natural resources. I'm talking about the cultural resources, because culture, again, is not like in the Western definition. Only human beings have culture. The seed has a culture. Salmon has a culture. Every living being, visible or non-visible, has a culture. Our deities and gods have a culture. So here we are dealing with something beyond the classical term within the Western tradition of what epistemology is about, right? So that is important to also note. And that is more or less my position in these days.
How about Sheryl and Nika, since...
I'll quickly, because I don't know who saw me do this to Jill, but I'm like, yeah, because how many times has Jill heard me say almost the exact same words, and I just thank you for those words. We're funnels for our community. There's more than one of us that do it. We're nothing without our community. And in working with larger institutions, it's just been having to take a higher road in the beginning to let the anger go and let the victimization go, because the people that work with us now weren't the people that did it then, and they have a responsibility to help us move forward. And I don't know if that really answers the question, but it's through persistence, diplomacy, mutual respect and understanding. Not that you guys have to respect and understand me, but I have to respect and understand you as well. There's no formula.
Go ahead. Okay. I want to echo all the way down, because that's exactly the way it is. I have a PhD. I'm the first in my community to get a PhD, and I know nothing. I am nothing but a student of those who've gone before me. Same. I'm on a constant learning path. I take from them, from their experience, and I try to do the duties and the responsibilities that have been asked of me. But I heard another part of your question about people who can build a bridge, working with other people who are not from the community, and how do we view that? How is that vision? When we're talking about a global movement to secure our fundamental human rights against incredibly oppressive and incredibly powerful states, we can't do it alone. We need a lot of help, and as much help as we can get from others who will mutually respect us and engage in this and recognize the value of what we bring to the table. So this is, and we've worked with a lot of people along the way. I've heard my elders talk about, yeah, back in the 70s, that was the Cold War time, so we were called communists, and we were called leftists, and we were called this and that and the other thing, and now the young people who are out doing these same things, we're called anarchists, and we're called anti-globalization people. And these are just allies, but they're allies of the moment. And as long as those allies mutually respect us, we will mutually respect them.
Nice.
Well, miigwech, hawa, I don't know the other two words to say, but thank you. And this conversation will continue. So thanks very much for staying so late with all of us. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, let me just also say that I think it's just wonderful. I'm eternally grateful to all of you for coming and to participating. And I think that also it's super late and people are tired, but this atmosphere already to have developed in this meeting is wonderful, and it's exactly what I hope we can carry through the weekend and beyond. Thank you, Coll.
Nice.
Good night.
Thanks.